So the Old Guard is based on a comic book by Greg Rucka, and the screenplay is actually by Greg Rucka. And it kind of feels like it's one of those type of comic books that kind of has like a lot of big and ambitious ideas, but doesn't quite get to them all within like a span of like a few issues, and just kind of leaves them lingering. Because I do love the premise of the Old Guard. I love the idea that there's this collective of immortals that kind of just randomly kind of come into existence and basically try to find a purpose for themselves over the course of centuries. And I love the idea that they're conflicted about, what role they have to play into humanity when they're so different from everyone else and they can live through so much. And there's a little bit of despair there between them about, how much good can we do in the world with these powers. Now they're led by Andy, played by Charlize Theron, who's referred to as the oldest member of this team, basically the team of immortals, kind of referred to as like the Old Guard by the film. And she's basically refers to herself as just old. Like, she's been around since the eras of of Vikings and witchcraft. She's the oldest of the immortals, and she's very, very much concerned about what kind of role that they play in the world, like more than any of the other members. The other members are Booker, who's kind of like this gruff guy from like the French Revolution days. He's just kind of like the little, not little, the gruff and likable guy who delivers some of the more a little bit more of the exposition, and gets into like a lot more like the grittier fight scenes. And then you have a couple by the name of Joe and Nikki, who are very, very different. Like, one of them was an Italian crusader, one of them was a Muslim warrior, and they formed a romance over the years. So we have a lot to work with these characters that I feel like if we just followed them, you would have a very compelling story here. You have Booker struggling to kind of make sense of the world, try to find a comfort with it. You have Andy not quite sure what to do with these powers and how to process them. You have Joe and Nikki, who have kind of tried to remain together for centuries and centuries and have a romance that can't be broken. There's so many of these interesting angles to pursue here. Especially I love the idea of their immortality, is that it's not like an instant thing. It's not like, they take a bullet and they're exactly fine. Like, they still feel pain, and it seems like they pass out, where normal person would die. They just kind of pass out for a little bit. They lie there on the ground, and then eventually they'll shove out the bullets, or, their stomachs would regrow. I'm kind of curious though, since this is essentially kind of like a little bit like a Wolverine power, I was kind of curious what would happen if you cut off one of their heads. I know that might be a little bit too much into horror territory. I just thought it might be an interesting avenue to explore here. And I only bring that up because what they do explore here is not really that interesting. It feels like a typical story you would do, like a typical comic book story that you would do about a story of immortals. So essentially the villain here is Stephen Merrick, who's a CEO of a pharmaceutical conglomerate. He's played by Harry Melling as this very cartoonish CEO. They set him up as, like he's supposed to be this very caring individual who wants to harness the power of the immortals to cure incurable diseases. But then, of course, no surprises here, by the second act, he just wants to enslave them to make the most money, and so he has to be stopped. I guess that's my biggest problem with the whole film. It starts off with all these big and interesting ideas, and then basically devolves so that it can just be kind of like a standard action film with some interesting fight scenes, and those cool special effects of just shoving out bullets and reanimating, which is kind of a downer. It doesn't make the film terrible. But like I said, there's a lot of stuff crowding it out here, especially when we're introduced to Niles Freeman, who's played by Kiki Lane, who's the latest immortal on the block. And I kind of like how the immortals instantly know when there's another immortal in the world. They feel their pain the moment that immortal comes into being, when they first experience their brush with death. So once Nile gets a severe cut to the face while she's serving in Afghanistan, she comes back to life, and the immortals immediately take her in and fill her in on the entire history of the Immortals. And I think this is kind of the problem with this type of story, is that because it takes place over the course of centuries and you have all this backstory, the film will literally just have to stop at times to tell you this entire history. Like there's a whole history about Andy falling in love with this woman, saying they'd never be apart, but then they were split apart and she didn't know if she'd ever see her again. There's an interesting avenue about how the Immortals are not quite immortal forever. Like you only get like a certain amount of reanimation times, and so your next reanimation could be your last, which is kind of scary. And I love the fact that it gives more urgency to that, because if you look at characters like, you know, like Wolverine or Deadpool, they're just going to keep reanimating over and over and over, and that's kind of their plight, and it's not as compelling when you know that they might survive a fight scene. Whereas with the Immortals, and eventually of course I do get to a part where the one of the Immortals is kind of like on their last legs, it does provide some urgency and some interesting appeal about coming to terms with mortality. Of course, this is in between all the action scenes, which you know, they range from pretty damn good to just kind of, you know, par for the course. Like, I think the problem is this film peaks really early with its fight scenes. There's a fight scene between Charlize Theron and Kiki Layne where they're in a cargo plane. And basically they have this knockdown, drag-out fights. They're slamming each other into walls. They're flipping over each other. They're taking punches. They're taking kicks. They're using like the turbulence of the plane to just get the advantage on the other person. It's a really cool kind of like bruised arm fighting sequence, and I really dug it. It's actually pretty clever the way it's shot too. But by the time we get to the climax, where essentially they have to scale a skyscraper to get to the evil CEO and kill him in his penthouse, it just kind of feels like it runs out of steam there. It's just kind of just running and gunning, and there's some like a few interesting fight scenes. There's one cool showdown in a skyway that Theron has with one of the guards. That's pretty neat. But considering that one of the icons of this film has been like Andy's kind of like old axe from the Viking days, you really don't get to see much of it in use by the end of the film, especially since Harry Melling is just kind of like running around with it, like trying to defend himself, which of course he can't because he looks like a cartoonish CEO. But yeah, I feel like there's a lot of interesting stuff to explore here, but it feels like a lot of it has to be told here rather than shown, which is kind of disappointing because the action looks really cool. The special effects of reanimation is real cool. But then like when we have to hear the history and these characters literally talk about themselves like to such an elongated degree, I think it kind of it took me out of the film like lots of times. In particular, there's a scene where Joe and Nikki are captured, and at one point the guards are kind of like make like a joking statement like, you know, what are you, two boyfriends or something? And of course they are. And I felt like what would have been really cool in that moment is just they say like, yeah, we are, and then they share a kiss. Now they do share a kiss in that scene, but before they do, one of them gives this very, very, very long speech about how they've been together for centuries. They have a blossoming romance, that they're far more than just boyfriends. And like, I can't help but feel like that maybe should have been like a line that should have been shared. Like, I feel like that would have been a better line to share with like Niall. So like Niall asks like, oh, you two are a couple? And it's like, no, we're not just a couple. Like, we've lived through this, and this, because it means more to them. Do you think the guards are really gonna show that much affection to them, since they make all the guards like just cartoonishly violent and all that? There are lots of scenes like that where they do a lot more telling than showing, which I wish they went into. They set up a lot of sequel stuff here, like including like a mid-credit Easter egg about, you know, who's gonna come in the next film. That I just feel like it always kind of took me out of the film. But it's an interesting idea, and I do like the fight scenes here. They're actually pretty clever, you know, even if I feel like it kind of peaked in the first act with Theron and Lane having a cool fight scene there. It's still fun for what it is. Like, I forgot to mention this too, like a lot of the dialogue here, I mentioned it with Joe and Nikki, is a little bit atrocious and kind of like, ooh, that maybe could have been written a little bit better. But for being little more than just like a, you know, popcorn entertainment with some very interesting characters that you usually don't see in these types of comic book and superhero films, it's all right for what it is. It has great ambition. It doesn't quite feel like it attains it. But it works pretty well for the fight sequences that it wants to stage, and kind of like and gives enough of an appeal to the idea of immortals than most comic book movies would. So I'm a little bit torn on it, but I kind of dug the film. So for The Old Guard, 3 out of 5 stars.